Hello, and welcome to a Cloud Developer channel. In the last video, we went through an exercise of adding jQuery library as well as the semantic UI CSS framework and Java components into our application. And what we did was we added those libraries to be able to start adding functionality to our application. However, in the initial video, I showed you how to add a menu as well as a footer as well as a little bit of content to show you that everything is working. Well, one of the things that we also talked about was being able to separate the different parts of your application into separate smaller components, and it will do a few things for us. One is it's actually going to allow us to perform easier maintenance on the application, as well as perform testing a lot better because you're able to then isolate your testing to just the components that you're actually making changes to, instead of having to worry about updating your entire test suite if you actually just updated one page in your application. So what I have here is I've opened Visual Studio Code, and we're already inside of our application. So what I'll do here first is I'm going to go ahead and open up the Explorer window here and open up the PowerShell window because I want to show you a couple of things. The first item I'm going to show you is that the application is working by starting it with ng-serve, and by providing --open, it will actually compile it as well as automatically open the browser for me to the actual web application itself. So you can see that the application started, and everything, just like it was before, is fully functional. So we have our simple content, as well as we have our pop-up that we added before. The other aspect I want to show you is we had some unit tests that we wrote before, and let me open up another window here, and I'm going to type in ng-test, and let's see what happens here. And what this should do is actually open up another browser session and go ahead and show us if we have any unit tests that are succeeding or failing, just to make sure that everything is functional before we start making changes to the application itself. So, and you can see some of the changes that we've done before. We didn't update the unit test, so let's go ahead and really quickly fix that so we have fully functioning tests before we begin making our changes. And as you can see, right now it's complaining about the app component should render a title in the h1 tag, and it's expecting welcome to the clouddeveloper.io channel, but it contains welcome to clouddeveloper.io channel. So let's go ahead and actually find that test. It's inside of the app component folder, and it's inside of app. And in the spec here, you can see that it says it should contain welcome to clouddeveloper.io channel. And inside of our app component HTML, we can actually see that we have added the word. So we go ahead and remove that and go ahead and save it. Go back to our page, and right now it still tells us because there's an exclamation point. There's 2 exclamation points inside of our unit test, but it's looking only for 1. So let's go ahead and update that real quick and go back, and you can see that all of the tests are passing. So now that we know all of our tests are passing, let's go ahead and get started and start breaking down the application into smaller components. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the testing. And the first place I'm going to show you where to get started is, let's actually have this app component HTML file open. So in this file, what we want to do is we want to take the first portion and put it into its own component. We want to take the content portion where it has the actual content, the actual 2-column layout, as well as the modal content, and then put that into its own component. And then we're going to take the footer and break it up into its own component as well. So the easiest way to do this is I'm going to go ahead and bring up the terminal window here. And I'm going to go ahead and use the Angular CLI command to actually generate a component. And the way you do that is by typing ng space g, which is going to tell the ng CLI command to go ahead and use a generator for a component, and by specifying component, and then I'm going to give it a name. So the first component I'm going to generate is going to be the application header component. So I'll just call it application dash header, press enter. And you'll notice a couple of things. So it created a few files as well as an updated an existing file. So let's take a look to see what it actually updated. In the app module.ts file, it actually added the application header component reference here, and it told this particular module itself that it needs to be aware of the application header component. And this is what enables your application, specifically the base application module itself, to know about the other components so you can actually start referencing and use them in your application. So for every component that you generate, it will actually go ahead and do that for you here, unless you do it manually by hand, and we'll go through that exercise as well. So let's go back to our app component HTML. And what we want to do is we want to take this div here, cut that from this file. We'll go ahead and save that. And you'll notice if I open up a browser, our main menu is actually gone. So let's go ahead and take a look at the app folder. And you can see in here that we have an application header folder now. And that folder got created by us running that command before, which generates the actual application header component itself. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and open up the HTML file, and I'll replace this content with the content that we've retrieved from the app component HTML, and I'll paste it right here. Now the next step I want to do is I want to actually go back into the app component HTML and go ahead and reference or add that particular new component into this page here. So, and the way you do that is by typing in the actual name of the component that you created. So in this case, it's app-application-header, and that's the naming convention that it uses. So, and I'll go ahead and close that tag. I'll go ahead and save it. And when we come back, you'll notice that the application header is back. But we also notice that there's no spacing between the actual icon as well as the actual clouddeveloper.io. The reason for that is because we actually have the app component.cs file that had the style specifically to create that space for us. So we'll go ahead and actually remove it from here, and we'll go to the application header component CSS file and we'll add it right here. So I'll go ahead and save that and go back, and as soon as it's reloaded, you can actually see that there's a space now here. So we're done with this particular component, and now what we want to do is we want to take the content component and the footer component and actually create those and move the relevant content into those files as well. So I'm going to go ahead and actually create all of those components right away. So I'll just call it content, and then I'll create another one that's called footer. You can see that it created the footer and the content components here. So I'll go ahead and close the other files here. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move the CSS content over to the appropriate files. So I'll move the CSS style for the container. And then I'm going to go ahead and move the footer CSS style into its respective footer CSS file. So those actions are done, and we can go ahead and close that. And now the next step I want to do is I'm going to take the content that should go into the content component, and I'll remove that from the main app component HTML file. And I'll save that, and I'll go into the application content HTML, and I'll replace that here. And I'll go ahead and save that as well. And then I'll take the footer content and I'll put it into the footer HTML and save that. So what we do want to also do now is we actually want to add those additional statements here to include the content component as well as the footer component. Okay, so as soon as we save it, we can actually see that everything now is broken up into individual components that we can start using. Now, a couple of things to note as well. We also have the .ts files, and they will also need to be updated because some of the content actually got shifted, and we need to make sure that the functionality is still working correctly. So the first thing you'll notice is that when I click Show Model, it doesn't actually do anything. Now, if you open up the Dev toolbar, you'll actually see that it's complaining that there is no Show Model function. So the reason for that is, again, the actual content got moved around to different files, so we want to make sure that we update the relevant files as well. So let's go back to the app component TS file, and you'll notice that we actually had that jQuery function that we actually added to be able to support the ability to call the semantic UI modal dialog box. So let's go ahead and actually relocate this logic into the appropriate view here. So we want to take this variable here, and we're going to go into the content TS file, application content TS file. And I'm going to go ahead and actually, in this file, clean this up a little bit. And I'll put this declaration up at the top. Remove some of the spacing here. And then because I also removed the method here that was on init, I no longer actually need that implementation of the interface as well as this on init import statement here. So, and I'm going to go back to the app component TS file, and I'm going to also move this show modal function over to that file as well. So here I actually have a plugin in Visual Studio Code that helps me identify if there's any kind of better ways to write code or any suggestions on how to actually write code properly using AngularJs. So in here it doesn't like the double quote, it actually wants to use single quote. So I'll go ahead and fix that. So now when we actually reload the application, click the show modal button, we can see everything is working again. So that basically, we can leave it at here at this point, but one of the things that I actually want to show you is if you go back to the application, you'll notice that I have clouddeveloper.io as well as the clouddeveloper.io listed right here on the bottom as well. And you also notice that the welcome to channel has changed. Before I actually used to say welcome to clouddeveloper.io channel. So the reason for that is because we actually moved some of the logic. You notice that in our main component we actually had a title, a variable that was set to the actual clouddeveloper.io value. But now we don't have that specified, and if we go to our HTML templates, you'll notice that in some of the templates we actually reference it like this, where we expect the title to be passed in to be rendered on that actual component when it gets rendered. But also in some places, so for example, if we go to the footer, we actually hard-coded the clouddeveloper.io value in here, which is not really nice because if we try to update it, we're going to have to update it in multiple places, and it's error-prone. So what we want to do is we actually want to change that to be able to pass that as a value to each component, so that we can pass that in from the main component and just update it in one place. It will actually work everywhere. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and update this template to use the title variable. So, and I'll just put in title in here. I'll go ahead and save that. Inside of the application header, we also have a reference to clouddeveloper.io, which shows up in the top left corner. And I'll go ahead and update that to also say title. And I'll go ahead and save that. And if we go back here, you can see that all those values are gone because nothing is being passed into them. Now, inside of the actual application content component, we already have that referenced here. So we just need to add the logic to be able to actually have it inside of the component itself. And then we'll update our main component to pass that value as well. So let's go ahead and close all these windows and just start updating one by one. So we'll go ahead and start with the application content component itself. In order to be able to inject these values into the component, we need to import another object here called input. And this is what's going to allow us to actually add or specify to Angular that we're going to expect an input variable to be passed into this component when it gets initialized, so that it can be used inside of a template. And the way you do that is you put an input and open close parenthesis, and then you specify the variable you want to use within this component. So in this case, it's going to be called title, and it's going to be of type string. So as soon as I do that, it's going to go ahead and actually update that. Now you'll notice that nothing got changed here, and that's because we actually need to pass it. So to do that, in order to pass that information over, what we need to do is inside of the content element tag, we need to specify the actual title or variable that, or the input argument that we're going to be passing in, and then we're going to specify what variable do we want to use from the app component itself to pass in the actual value. And because the input argument inside of the application content component is called title, we also have the local variable within the app component itself called title. So that's why they're actually the same. If I go back, you'll notice that now it says welcome to clouddeveloper.io channel. So it's passing the values correctly. So what I can do now is I can also go back to the application footer component, and I'll replace this with input, get rid of this code that I'm not using here, and I'll specify the input parameter here as well. And I'll go ahead and save that. And I'm going to go to the application header and do the same steps again. Okay. So as soon as I saved it and I go ahead and reload, and the thing I forgot is we need to actually pass those values in. So I'll simply copy and paste this string here, save, and it reloads, and we can see that now the variable value is being passed in to all of the components. So it's in our header, it's in our footer, as well as inside of the actual welcome content. So let's see if it actually works the way we expected it to by going to the app components, and let's say we change it to testing. So it should now say clouddeveloper.io testing. As soon as I save that, you could see that the section in a header actually got updated, the content got updated, and the actual footer got updated all to the same value. So I'll go ahead and remove that change and save it again, and everything went back. So this is what makes it actually a lot simpler to be able to maintain your application going forward. Now the last thing I want to actually show you is we also simply created one component to host the actual content section. Now that worked for today, but let's say tomorrow we need to add a lot more granular functionality inside of a content area, and we'll end up having the same problem by having one massive content component, which we don't want to do. So what I'm going to show you real quick here is how do you create a subcomponent within the component itself. And you do that by simply creating a couple of files using specific naming conventions. And I'll call this one user notification, the component.ts. And I'll go ahead and create that here. And I'm going to create another file, and that's going to be called user notification component.html. And that's going to host the actual template itself for the HTML content that I want that component to have. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to our application content component.html and pull out the actual definition for HTML content for the modal itself, and we're going to put that into the user notification component. So I'll go ahead and save that here. And when we go back to our user notification component TS file, it's blank. So we want to actually put the logic that will allow us to actually represent what this component is. Now, what I do have installed is Angular Essentials, which is a plugin in Visual Studio Code that has the Angular language service as well as the Angular TypeScript snippets. And it would actually allow me to use some snippets that are already made available to make it easier for me to create new components. So I'll simply type in a dash, and I'll need to initialize it again. And then if I hit tab, it basically adds all the content that I need. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify app-user notification. And this is actually going to be the value we're going to put into the application content component to reference this component so it injects the actual HTML content. And in here, I'll just call this the user dash notification.html, that component.html. And this is actually the file that we created before, that has the actual HTML content inside of it. And then I'll call this user notification component. So in here, again, I'll just go ahead and remove the default logic that I'm not using in this component, because all I care about is just the HTML content. And what you'll notice here is that there's a squiggly line here under the component telling me that the component user notification is not included in the main module, and so your application will not know anything about this. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to go to the app-module.ts, and in here we're going to take this import statement here, and we'll duplicate that, and we'll call this user notification component, and we're going to actually import it by specifying the name of the component, which is user dash notification and that component. So and then the next item we're going to do is we're going to add it to the declarations section, and as soon as we do that, it should actually allow us to start using it. So the way we start using it is by simply adding the reference to that component, and it's going to be the app-user notification. I'll go ahead and close that. And as soon as I save it, I should be able to go back here, and it's actually fully loaded here. And by clicking that show modal button, now I actually see everything working as it was before. But now it's actually contained into a separate file and allows me to test that specific component individually without having to rely and initialize the main application component or the application content component. So that is how you actually separate out your application into multiple components, and this will help you not only maintain your application going forward, but also help you in being able to test it easier, which I'll show you in the next video. Because now you have the components isolated in very small chunks of logic that allow you to write your automated unit test just for that component, in case that component needs to change and it doesn't change anything else in your application. So if you have any questions, go ahead and leave your feedback in the comment section below. If you like this content, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And provide any feedback if you like this content, if you don't like it, if you want to see something different. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you next time.